Okay, today guys we're going to talk a little bit about another type of lipid, which is a steroid. And steroids all have one common structure, and it's this 4 fused ring structure. So if you're looking at pictures of molecules and you see these 4 fused rings, you know that it's a steroid. Okay, and steroids have a little bit of a bad name because when we think of steroids, we may think of anabolic steroids. And anabolic steroids are the ones that are abused by athletes in order to bulk up, right? And that's just one type of steroid. There's many steroids that we rely on in our everyday operations of our bodies that are much more important and actually interesting than anabolic steroids. So we're going to talk about steroids as a class, as lipids. Now remember, with lipids, there's not really a common monomer that makes up these larger macromolecules, these larger biomolecules. And so for steroids, when we're thinking about structure, the 4 fused rings is kind of what we're looking for. And there's a 6-membered ring attached to a 6-member, attached to a 6-member, and then attached to a 5. So it always looks this way: 3 6s and a 5. One of the most common steroids, and especially for us as human beings, is cholesterol, and that looks like this. And so if you wanted to pause the video for a second, then you can draw it out. But you will notice that you have 6 membered rings, 1, 2, 3, and a 5-membered ring. And then from that basic structure, you have various functional groups that are sticking off of it. We also have a double bond down here in this particular location, and that adds a specific character to this particular molecule. So cholesterol has an alcohol group over here. So we have an alcohol functional group that's off of this last 6-membered ring. We have a methyl group, that's a CH3, another methyl group here. And then we kind of have this antenna of hydrocarbons. And I drew it out with the chemical formula. This is kind of the condensed version. And then I drew it in the lightning bolt version here. So if you put this right here on top of this ring, then this is that structure that's coming off of cholesterol. I always say it looks a little bit like an antenna. Cholesterol is important because it is in our cell membranes. And you hear, though, that too much cholesterol is a bad thing. Just as a note on the name while I'm thinking about it, the name cholesterol ends in OL, and with IUPAC rules and because of the patterns, we know that the OL means that we're going to have an alcohol group of some sort. So just by looking at the name, we would predict it would have an alcohol functional group in it. And remember that the functional groups are going to allow, and the shape of this thing, are going to allow for its various characteristics. Cholesterol is also really important in humans because it's the precursor to all of our other steroids. Okay, and so when we're talking about other important steroids in our body, then we're talking about things like sex hormones, and we'll get into the classifications there soon, and I'll show you some examples of that. Things like vitamin D. And then also another thing that it's a precursor to are bile salts. And so this isn't necessarily a steroid, but I guess it's more in line with the precursor part of it, bile salts. And we'll get into why this is important later in the chapter. But cholesterol is incredibly important in human beings. And we can see that it has that same type of structure. So within steroids, one of the most important functions that they have is as hormones. And so I want to talk a little bit about hormones, kind of in the context of steroids. Steroid hormones. So let's talk about hormones in general. We know what hormones are because we all went through puberty, so hormones were probably our enemy for a while. But in general, hormones are chemical messengers. So a messenger of some sort. And these messengers come from a specific gland. So they're sent from a specific gland. And we're not going to get into all of the nitty-gritty details about which glands secrete which hormones, etc. But it's just important to kind of know generally how they work. So they're sent from a specific gland to a target tissue or organ of some sort, and they're traveling through the bloodstream. And they're going to a specific target organ. And these hormones know where they're going because of specific signals that they have on their particular structures. And the thing that they do in the tissue that they're targeted towards is based on that shape. Okay, so once they get to that particular organ or gland or tissue or whatever it is that they're going to, then they trigger a response. Whatever that response is. And that response is going to be based on the shape of the molecule fitting into the receptor that it's meant to go into. So we have our hormones that have this specific backbone structure, and based on the stuff that's hanging off of those rings, that will trigger a specific response in specific tissues. And within these steroid hormones, there are two major types. The first that we're going to talk about are adrenocorticoid hormones. So adrenocorticoid hormones, that's a T. And these adrenocorticoid hormones come in the adrenal glands. And I'm not sure how much medical stuff you guys have had so far. Some of you probably more so than others, but renal in general refers to kidneys. And so adrenal means that these glands are above the kidneys, on top of the kidneys. That's what the prefix ad means. So the adrenal glands are on top of the kidneys. Okay. And within that, so adrenocorticoid, the reason that the cort in there is because they're found in the cortex of the adrenal gland. And cortex, just like your brain or just like any other organ, is kind of the outermost layer. Okay, so these adrenocorticoids are produced in the outermost layer of the gland that's on top of the kidneys. Okay, that's kind of where we're situated in terms of the body. And within these adrenocorticoids, there's actually two different types of steroids that are produced. And so we have kind of two minor groups that are in this major group. So adrenocorticoid is our major group, and within that we have two kind of subgroups. The first are mineralocorticoids. Mineralocorticoids. So mineralo refers to the fact that we're messing with ions. So ions are kind of the name of the game with minerals. When we're talking about minerals in our bodies, we're usually talking about things like, you know, sodium or potassium or magnesium or calcium or any of the minerals in our body. Okay, so we're talking specifically about ions and regulating their concentration. That's kind of the goal of mineralocorticoids. And this is within different body fluids, and we'll kind of look at an example here. So an example of one of our mineralocorticoids is called aldosterone. Just looking at the ending, ONE, then we would guess that it probably has a ketone functional group in it, right? And we would be correct. Aldosterone is used in the absorption of sodium and chloride in your kidneys. So when you have table salt, when you have salt on your food, then that breaks apart in your body into sodium ions and chloride ions, and then your sodium and your chloride that's in your body is absorbed into your kidneys. And one of the things that helps to facilitate that is aldosterone. So this is one of our mineralocorticoids, and it looks like this. Here's our 4 fused ring structure. We always start with our 4 fused rings. There's my 3 6-membered rings and my 5-membered ring. Okay, so there's my backbone. On the number 1 ring over here, here's my ketone, right? So carbon, carbon, carbon with a double bonded oxygen here. So here's my carbonyl with a carbon on each side. So there's the ketone that I was expecting just based on the name, right? There's a double bond here in that first ring. There's a methyl group. That kind of looks like cholesterol so far with the methyl group right there. There is an alcohol group, an OH. There is an aldehyde. Okay, so this is an aldehyde group. That's a carbon, double bonded oxygen. That's a carbonyl with a hydrogen, hence aldo. So we were kind of expecting an aldehyde as well. And then you find another ketone. Here's a carbonyl, and there's our carbon, 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 and then off of this is an OH. Okay, so this carbon is attached to an alcohol group. So we can see that we have a number of different alcohol groups here. There's one here, so there's our hydroxyl groups. We have an aldehyde right here, and we have 2 ketones, one right here and one right here. Okay, so this is aldosterone. That's this guy right here. Aldosterone. And aldosterone helps to one of the things that it does is help with the absorption of sodium and chloride, like I mentioned, but the way that it does this is by regulating our water balance. So if you've ever heard of reabsorbing water, right? So you're really dehydrated and you talk about, oh, well, I'm not going to drink more water. I'm just going to reabsorb the stuff that's in my body, kind of jokingly, right? Or I'm going to eat more salt and that's going to help to reabsorb some of the water. Well, this is the molecule that helps you do that because it's allowing water to move from one area to another based on how much sodium and chloride you have in your kidneys, and the flow of these ions is going to be based on how much water is present, and that happens through osmosis and a couple other different kind of processes. So we'll get into that a little bit later, but that's aldosterone. That's a mineralocorticoid, just one example that helps with the regulation of minerals in general in our body. So the way that this kind of works is if we increase the concentration of our sodium ions, so these brackets here mean concentration. So if we have a greater amount of sodium ions, then that's going to increase the amount of water that we retain. Okay, so we have more water retention when we have an increased amount of sodium, and that makes sense. We have more minerals, we have more of this kind of solute, if you wanted to think about it in terms of solutions, then that's going to keep around more water in order to balance out the right concentrations. And this is how this mineralocorticoid helps to regulate such things. Okay, so that's one. That's the first little subgroup within the adrenocorticoids. The second is the glucocorticoids. So here's number 2 of our subgroups, glucocorticoids. And because there's an elegance to IUPAC in the way that we name things, the prefix gluc here should make you think of glucose. So you might think that maybe these structures are going to have something to do with carbohydrates, and you would be correct. Glucocorticoids enhance our carbohydrate metabolism. So enhancing it means that it's easier to do, right? So it's easier to metabolize carbohydrates when we have these glucocorticoids around. And one of the examples of these is cortisol. And just looking at cortisol, the ending right here, OL, that should make you think of an alcohol group, and you would be correct. So let's draw this guy out. Again, if you need to pause the video after these drawings are done in order to get them in your notes, then please feel free to do so. You will also run into diagrams of them in your book. So there's our backbone structure. For cortisol, we have a similar structure here. This is actually a ketone. Again, we have our methyl group. This kind of looks like our mineralocorticoid that we just looked at. So our aldosterone. And then we have our alcohol group here. Again, that's the same. We have a methyl group here. And then off of this one, we have kind of some weirdness. We have an alcohol group, and then we have a carbonyl. And then from here, we have an OH. Okay, so this looks pretty similar to our other molecule that we just looked at. So the mineralocorticoids all look very similar to each other because they're produced in the same area. So the cortisol here, the reason that we're focusing on the alcohol groups is we have two of them. Here's two alcohol groups, and then there's this third that's in the other. So there's three alcohol groups, there's two ketones, okay, and we have some methyl groups hanging off the ends as well. So this cortisol, it helps to increase the glucose and glycogen concentrations in the body. So we're increasing our glucose and glycogen in our body. And remember, when we were talking about carbohydrates, we said glucose is one of those things that's kind of a source of quick energy, but it also allows, because it is blood sugar, it moves really readily through the body, and so it's usually used more for storage. We use that glucose to put together in larger polysaccharides in our body, like glycogen, which allow for quick kind of fight or flight mechanisms in our muscles. That's where we find glycogen. This process, however, though, we said that it comes from the adrenal glands on the kidneys. The process takes place in the liver. So our liver and our kidneys both help to kind of process things through our bodies. So they're both used in metabolism in general, and they're also used to help filter the things that we need in our bodies and filter out the things that we don't need. Cortisol is also used as an anti-inflammatory. So it's sometimes used, if you've heard of cortisol shots or cortisol creams, they're used in the treatment of asthma and arthritis. And the reason for this is because there's a derivative of cortisol that's called cortisone, and then you've probably heard of that too, and it's also got these anti-inflammatory properties. So you've probably seen the cortisone creams, right? Hydrocortisone, that's a cream that you can use on your joints. Cortisone shots are also a thing. So cortisone and cortisol are very similar to each other. The only difference is in this alcohol group right here. This alcohol group in cortisone is a ketone instead of an alcohol. and that's the difference in the naming as well. So the alcohol group there is cortisol. If that's a ketone group there, then it's cortisone. Okay, and they both do similar things in the body, but cortisol is more involved with our carbohydrate metabolism, and cortisone is more involved in the anti-inflammatory stuff, just kind of in general. Okay. So that's a glucocorticoid. So we have these two classes within our adrenocorticoids, mineralocorticoids and glucocorticoids. And so these are the two that I want you to know for those two groups. Now, that was just the first major type of steroid hormones. We said there's two major groups. The second major group, kind of going back to our original list, are our sex hormones, which we mentioned earlier when we were talking about cholesterol. We said that cholesterol is the precursor to the sex hormones. And the reason you'll see is that they look very similar to cholesterol. Sorry, I'm so used to talking about cortisol now. They look very similar to cholesterol. You just have to make a couple changes to those groups that are sticking off of them. So for our sex hormones, we have kind of two major types. We have the male sex hormones, which are called androgens. Androgens are the overall classification for male sex hormones, and the female sex hormones are called estrogens. And we as human beings have both. We have androgens and estrogens, and we have them at specific times in our life, more so than others, and they allow for our different sex characteristics. So in different points of our life, you know, early on as we're developing, then these androgens and estrogens, the balance that we have will allow for the different characteristics that we develop over time. And then in puberty as well, when we have an influx of these extra hormones, then that allows for some of our secondary sex characteristics. So for example, testosterone is one that we all know. Testosterone is a male sex hormone, so it's an androgen, and it looks like this. There's our 4-ring fused structure. And then we have a little bit of this and a little bit of this. Just by looking at the name of it, testosterone, we would expect that ketone to be there. And we also have an alcohol group. So we have two kind of interesting functional groups and two methyl groups off of our 4 fused ring structure. So we have 2 methyl groups, an alcohol and a ketone. So this is testosterone, and it promotes the secondary sex characteristics. So secondary sex characteristics for men, right? So for males, secondary sex characteristics would be things like an increase in muscle density, right? So males can bulk up a little faster than females can, especially around puberty. So you find that developing males tend to get bigger faster, or lose weight a little bit faster, or be able to build muscle a little bit faster. Part of that is because of testosterone. They also start to get facial hair, for better or for worse for the boys, since they have to shave it all the time then, and they get a deeper voice. Okay, so that's testosterone. It's an androgen. If we compare testosterone to another one that is fairly familiar, and this is an estrogen, estradiol. Just by looking at the name estradiol, diol means that we have 2 alcohol groups. And so let's draw this thing. Here's our 4 fused ring structure. We actually have a phenol group on estradiol. It's a benzene ring with an OH on it. Sorry. It's a benzene ring with an OH on it, so that's a phenol functional group. And then we also have a methyl group off of this guy. And we have an OH as well. So we have 2 alcohol groups, one at the end here on our benzene, one over here where we had one on the other. And if you look at the difference between these two molecules, then the major difference is the methyl group that's here and the bonding scheme, right? So this is a ketone, this is an alcohol or a phenol if you wanted to include the benzene ring in it, and that's the only difference between the two. So estradiol is an estrogen. It's responsible for the secondary sex characteristics for females. Okay, and so some of the secondary sex characteristics for females are higher voices. So instead of deepening, then your voice tends to stay a little bit on the higher side. This prevents us from getting facial hair. So in terms of balance between estrogens and androgens, the more estrogens you have, the less facial hair that you would have. And also, of course, breasts. That occurs during your puberty, right? During secondary sex characteristic time, which is puberty. So for women, if we're talking about the facial hair issue, as we get older, we go through menopause later in life, and menopause is the time when we start producing fewer of our sex hormones, so we have fewer estrogens around. And one of them that we have fewer around of is estradiol. And so if we have less estradiol, then that's the thing that's preventing us from getting facial hair. And sometimes you'll see, as women get older, they tend to get more and more facial hair. And so that's when waxing comes into play. But there you go. All right, so we've talked today about steroids in general, that they have this 4 fused ring structure in common, and we've talked about 2 major classifications, adrenocorticoids and sex hormones. And within the adrenocorticoids, we talked about 2 classifications, mineralocorticoids and our glucocorticoids. And within the sex hormones, we've talked about androgens versus estrogens. So I think that's enough for today. If you have any questions, as always, don't hesitate to reach out, and I'll talk to you again.